This is House Planning Help episode 288. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in better homes, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guest is Russel Hayden from Hayden Architecture and Passive House Design. And we're going to be looking at his own renovation in Manchester. This is part of a mini-series that we're doing on retrofit. So that's in a few moments. Do you ever get this with birthdays? Either you completely forget them or perhaps you just don't celebrate them as much as you used to. Certainly get that as you get a bit older. House Planning Help is now 8 years old and I completely missed that last month, so I thought I'd flag it up. And also, thank you just for sticking with us for the journey. The hub is also now 5 years old. I can't believe that. And it's that I want to talk to you about, because the case studies that we've got in there, I think we're at the stage of looking for another one. I had wondered whether I might be able to dive straight into another project, but I think I've got a bit of work to do first. So I just thought I'd put the feelers out there. Is there an interesting project that you're involved with that we could get access to film high quality content? I run a production company, Regen Media, so we don't mess around. This is an entire build as well. This is why in 5 years, we've only done 3 builds. It's because we're following complete projects and putting them into little packages and trying to make them as helpful as possible. That's always the aim of the hub, is just to take the learning further. So we've done ICF, we've done timber frame, we've done masonry, all passive house projects. Maybe we do something different this next time round, although I'd quite like to go through all of the build systems first to see what the different passive house challenges are. But whatever we do, we want to keep them high performance buildings. And sometimes I find this when I'm doing a podcast, that I'll be chatting to someone, I think, oh, that would have been so good as a hub case study. So if you're involved in something, please get in touch through the website. Something that obviously hasn't started. We don't want it halfway through. But I have noticed recently, for members who've signed up to the hub, quite often I'll get an email or we have a chat and I'll discover that they've binge watched all of the hub case studies. So that is excellent. And I know maybe my initial plan was to have more in there after 5 years of doing the hub, but I will keep on going. I'm just going to keep chipping away. The more members we have, the more money we can plow back into our hub case studies and all the other features that we've got in there. So I'll tell you more about that later. But of course, now we want to get to our interview, and we're looking at an upgrade of a 3-bedroom house initially built in 1961. So we're chatting to architect Russel Hayden, and I wanted to read you a couple of points on the brief here. Remodel the existing building fabric, but remain true to the original house. Be certifiable to a recognised passive house standard without compromising on design, and be simple and affordable. So I thought all of those, that's exactly what you want from a retrofit, isn't it? So let's find out more, shall we? And I thought I'd give you the show notes page just now, because sometimes it can be a little bit tricky if we're talking about all of this and you've no idea what the project actually looks like. Well, you can tap this up right now if you fancy. I'll mention it again at the end though as well. houseplanninghelp.com/288. I started by asking Russel to tell me a little bit about his background.
Well, I'm an architect and I've worked all my working life in London. And about 4 years ago, decided that we'd outgrown London, and with a young family, our priorities changed. So in a move to be, I suppose, primarily closer to our in-laws, we moved up north and Stockport became our new home. So we found this derelict house, as it happens, right opposite my in-laws, for better or worse, and it's proved to be a perfect project, really, for I guess our new life. So now we're living here and really enjoying what's effectively a passive house, but not quite, which we'll come to, I guess, in more detail in a moment.
Yeah. Now, as an architect, is it your dream always to build new, or did you quite like this challenge?
No, I think I've always been completely open-minded, and I guess on balance, I prefer the challenge of doing something to an existing building. It is more difficult. It adds a level of complexity, but I think a level of interest alongside that. So you always have surprises, and it's more fun.
What I was going to ask you as a key question, and maybe something that we can bear in mind as we go through this interview, about money. How did you set your budget?
When we left London, we were fortunate to own a house in London and kept that and rented it out. And as it happens, at about the same time, we received a small inheritance, which allowed us to purchase this property in Stockport and gave us a little left over for the renovation works. And the budget was set effectively by what we thought the house would be worth once it was complete. We went over budget. We're both architects and inevitably spend more than you expect to, but
well, you're both architects. For self-builders, it's even worse because you've got all the knowledge and you know what territory you're going into.
Yes, well, that you would like to think so, and I mean it was helpful to have set the budget because it gave us a clear direction and clear target, and we got pretty good value, I think, from what we did. And there were a few things. We had a few little extravagances. We wanted a nice kitchen, but as a rule, we managed to keep it simple and pretty much worked to that budget.
Just tell us about that valuing process. So how did you know what it might finish up being worth, and were you right?
That's a good question. We I guess we're just looking on Rightmove to see what things we're doing in this area. I mean, we're fortunate that it's a rising market here. We're in Heaton Moor, close to Didsbury. And since we've finished the work, we've had it valued, and actually it's significantly more than we had expected. And interestingly, the estate agent didn't really know what to make of it because he'd never previously valued a passive house, and there's nothing else like it around here. So he was slightly pulling figures out of the air, to be honest. But no, we think it's certainly worth more than we had anticipated. But in a sense, it's incidental. Whilst we had seen this as a stepping stone, we weren't expecting to stay here. Living in suburbia didn't seem like our thing, but actually we really like it here, and we absolutely love the house, and we have no intention of moving. So it's here for a while.
Fantastic story. So we've got the valuation. We've presumably got what it costs to buy the house. Is it just a subtraction at that point to work out roughly what budget you could play with, and how much did you have as contingency versus your main budget?
We had some contingency, and we were under some time pressure, to be honest, which meant that we launched into the project, in fact, while we were still in London, and found a local builder who basically stripped the house back to the bare bones, and we just set him off underway. We then, quite soon after that, moved up here, and I then took on the project management role of finishing drawings and overseeing what he was doing and managing all the procurement of materials and things as well. So he didn't give us a firm price at the outset, simply because we hadn't completed all the drawings, and there were a number of things which weren't fully resolved. But we felt confident in proceeding, I guess, because we weren't novice. We knew what our limitations were, but it felt manageable and it felt affordable, and so we cracked on, and it's worked out pretty well.
How did you find this builder?
He was recommended, actually, by somebody who just finished another project with him. And he was a nice guy who had never done anything like this before, but he had a really good attitude, solved problems, was proactive, and he was generally used to doing smaller projects. And it was interesting that you could sense every now and again frustration by him having to work out of his usual sequence while I did the taping. I was the taping champion on the project. So whilst he bought into the principle of Passive House and was watching YouTube videos into the night to learn more, which was admirable. And he was really interested in what all meant and how it might change things. But equally, there were times of frustration when he was not able to just crack on and finish what he would normally have done as, I suppose, effectively a jobbing builder.
So do you think this was a learning curve, really? That was what the frustration was?
Most definitely. Learning curve for him and for us also, because we'd not tackled anything on this scale before. I'd done the Certified Passive House Designer course just before leaving London, so I'd got some theoretical knowledge about the requirements and the science behind Passive House, and then was effectively cutting my teeth, I suppose, on the practical side of it, rather thrown into at the deep end. But on reflection, it was absolutely the best way to do it. I learned a huge amount. And the other thing I would say is I also now have huge respect for builders. Having done the materials procurement, have a better understanding of just how much work is involved in getting materials and then finding the best price, getting them on site when you need them. It takes a huge amount of time, and I can now see, having worked on bigger projects in London, I can now see why contractors have a team of surveyors behind the scenes doing all of this admin work. So it's a lot of work.
Let's talk about that relationship a bit more with the builder. How were you working with the builder? Were you just paying a day rate, or did you do a project cost? Because you mentioned you hadn't got the drawings, which is always, they're going to get a bit nervous.
Yeah, it was very simple. We paid him a day rate. It was one guy and his two lads with him, and we had a daily rate, and they basically did what we asked them to do. I think it's not something that we would, as a professional, I wouldn't recommend a self-builder to do that unless you are on site every day and you know what you're doing, because you could very easily come unstuck.
Were you on site every day?
I was on site every day. We moved into my in-laws' house opposite, which was a dream arrangement in many ways, and was able to keep a very good eye on things.
Let's go back a step, and the actual site. Was it always going to be this property just because of its location near to the in-laws, or was there something about it that you liked, that you thought this is perfect for retrofit?
That's a good question. I mean, it's serendipity, to be honest, because we happened to be staying across the road when this house came on the market. I think it was a February half term or something. It had been empty for, we think, getting on for 10 years. And it was ripe for development. The garden was massively overgrown, huge trees growing in the back garden in particular. And it was just a very sad and sorry state. And we'd seen this, but hadn't thought anything about it, just that it needed sorting out. Then it came on the market. It went to sealed bids. We were very fortunate to win the bid. And
can I just stop you there? Because our one went to sealed bids as well, and we lost out a number of times. So how did you win it?
We bumped the price up, basically.
We thought we bumped the price up, but it didn't work.
I think, yes, who knows? I mean, it's pure chance, isn't it? We went over about, I think it was about between 5 and 10% more than the asking price. I can't remember exactly what it was now, but we had a good relationship with the estate agent, and I think they were quite helpful as well. So do
you think that helped you in putting in the right bid? Because they're not allowed to say anything, technically,
no, they're
are
not. They? No, but they obviously have a rapport with the clients. And I mean, I think if I was in the receiving position, I would be keen to make sure the house went to an owner that was going to either take good care of it or do something nice with it. They knew we were architects. I mean, it's a good question, Ben, because in fact, thinking about it now, this was a probate case. The reason it's been empty for so long is because the owners had died and they couldn't find the heirs for it. So I think they eventually found somebody in Austria, or somebody who had a nice little windfall.
Should we get back on track then? Sorry, I just heard that and I thought, oh, that's interesting. So you were talking through acquiring the house.
Yes, so we won the bid, and then realised that this was a project. We engaged EnerPHit to help us with the Passive House consultancy, because I realised that I wasn't going to have sufficient experience to properly tackle this by myself. So we looked at the options of how far do we take it. They provided a very helpful report setting out, I think, 4 options, from getting it to building reg standard, doing it up to AECB Silver, as it was then, going to EnerPHit, and going all the way to Passive House standard. So they set all this out for us in a report, and we made the decision pretty early on that we were going to go for EnerPHit. For me professionally, this was going to become effectively my business card for my new venture up north. And so we felt it was important that we got as close as we could to something that was certifiable and within reasonable cost. So that effectively then set our brief. And on reflection was a very helpful device, actually, because it then made everything very clear about what we had to do. And I think that's one of the beauties, really, of Passive House, is that although there's infinite ways of achieving it, you do have a very real target. And with PHPP, you can obviously play games which help you to understand the more you do here, the less you have to do there, and so on. So it's a really useful starting point.
Now, we know a lot about the Passive House methodology. We've talked a lot in relation to new build, because that's what the podcast's been about. And back in the day, we did a lot on retrofit. But what does this mean then specifically when you're looking at some of the constraints of retrofit?
Perhaps best answered by a couple of specific examples. We decided early on to wrap the building externally with insulation. So we've got external wall insulation. It needed a new roof. The brickwork, it's a brick block cavity wall, had absolutely no insulation whatsoever, and it needed sweetening up in some way. So we took the decision we're going to wrap it externally, new roof. That effectively then gave us a very clear steer of how we were going to develop the project. One of the biggest challenges was with the existing floor, which was a concrete ground-bearing slab, and it's the usual problem of what do you do at the perimeter, which is a massive cold bridge, and the whole project was, to be honest, the only significant cold bridge that was a concern. What we decided to do was to retain the slab and put insulation on top of it, and accept that there was going to be a cold bridge there. We mitigated that by dropping insulation down the outside. So we've got 150 mil of Dow styrofoam dropping down to foundation level. So it helps, and it's clearly not as good as a new build where you'd build the whole thing off an insulated raft, but it was as good as we could get without spending an absolute fortune. And the height that we lost internally was not too much of a problem, because we decided to build it up to effectively one step of the stairs. So we lost one stair height. And the first floor ceiling, we took off the plasterboard and exposed the joists to give the sense of a bit more height. So we've now got a height of 2.25, I think it is, to the underside of the joists, which is, it's okay, and it looks a bit rustic because the joists are all gnarled and they've got holes cut through them where they've had heating pipes in the past, and we quite like the slightly more rustic look of that, and I think it divides opinion to some extent, but most people like it. So, I mean, we were, I think, relatively lucky with the fabric of the building because it was in fairly good shape. What we did decide very early on was to minimize any structural alterations. There was a chimney breast which went up through the roof. That obviously doesn't work well with Passive House. We took that out early on and replaced structure where we needed to for that. But in order to keep the cost down, we were really keen to, for instance, not go moving windows and doors around unless we absolutely felt it was necessary. So I think that was a positive, actually, because we I'm sure saved quite a lot with that, because that inevitably costs more money.
And when you're going external insulation, were there any constraints on how you finish that on the outside?
Not really, no. We ended up going for planning permission simply because the planners, again, had not previously had anything like this and were concerned about the additional size of the building. Believe it or not, the insulation thickness was 280 mils, so fair enough, it was going to increase by 0.5 metre plus a bit, and the ridge line, of course, would have gone up by a foot or so because of the additional thickness of roof. But the render was not a planning constraint, interestingly. We were expecting it to be, but they weren't concerned about that.
Can you tell me a little bit about the space that you added where the garage was?
The existing garage was massive and much bigger than we needed, so we cut that short and extended onto the back of it to form what's effectively a garden room. And it felt like the obvious thing to do, and it's worked out really nicely because now we have a space where I work, we have an exercise studio, and it's added a lot to the house. And although clearly from a cost point of view, you've got additional footings and additional fabric, it's a timber frame, very simple. This, in fact, is timber clad externally with a straightforward flat roof on it. So it was a good value addition to the project.
And what about some of the other features? How have you given it a lift, a facelift, really, in this area?
I think what makes it special for us is we worked quite hard to lift the interior finishes, and this is where Anna has spent a lot of time researching materials and finding fittings which are not necessarily very expensive, but she has a very good eye for finishes. And for instance, we put down a parquet floor from industrial wood flooring, which extends right across the ground floor, apart from in the studio, which is screeded, but right across the floor. And upstairs as well, we have a slightly different colour oak parquet, which goes in every room. And you have continuity between the spaces, which just helps the room to flow. Together with upstairs, because we rebuilt all the partitions, we had full height doors. And that makes a huge difference because, again, you see the ceiling, the plasterboard ceiling upstairs. You get continuity between the spaces, and that together with the floor really gives it a lift. And I think that for me has made a big contribution to the joy, really, particularly of the space upstairs.
Well, we'll definitely add some images into the show notes so people, as they're listening to this, can check it out and have a look. What was the biggest challenge then on this project?
I think one of the biggest challenges was actually making the connection between the fabric of the existing box, if you like. It's a very straightforward, it's a very ordinary house, to be honest. Where the extension and the garage connect onto that, getting the detail of that to work, minimizing thermal bridges was one of the biggest challenges. And we didn't quite hit our target for air tightness. We got to 1.1, I think, which is over 1.1, which was immensely frustrating. But I'm fairly certain there were shortcomings in some of the workmanship around that connection between the existing building and in particular the new build. I think things are never perfect, and you get them as good as you can, and you get to the point where you've just got to hope for the best. And unfortunately, the best wasn't quite good enough to get the certificate we were hoping for. But
so were you able to check that out as you went along, or at what stage did you realise that you were going to have to settle for 1.1?
We did 3 tests, and I think the penultimate one, we were in the process of forming the connection between existing and new. And we realised at that time we were it was looking as if it was going to be a struggle. And then when we did the final air test, it obviously wasn't good enough. But by that time, we'd really gone past the point of being able to remedy where I think the problem was.
So explain what you might be doing on a typical day, project managing this, coming in, doing your materials. Was there a bit of a rhythm that got going?
Yeah, I think there was. I'd start off doing some sketching. The builder, being a jobbing builder, of course, was rubbish at reading drawings, never looked at them, didn't see the point in them. But he did engage with 3D hand-drawn doodles, and suddenly he got it. And so I would typically start sketching and then looking to see what was coming up, because inevitably you need to anticipate workflows and look a few days ahead to see what he was going to need. So I then spend a bit of time probably working at my desk. Then there'd be a delivery of some sort coming in. So I go across, sort that out, see what the builder's up to, make sure he was fine. And it was just backwards and forwards, to be honest. It was every day was different, that's for sure.
And what did you learn from the project?
I learnt that you need to be quite patient with people. We got to the point with the builder where I think he'd really done as much as he wanted to do, and so we were having to tread rather carefully with him because we really wanted him to finish so that we could move in. And I think one of the things we learnt is that with the right approach, you can get people to do a lot and find your way. I guess the other thing was just from a personal knowledge point of view, a much better understanding, having been on the tools, as it were, particularly with the Passive House taping, actually just what works and what doesn't work. And I think that feeds in, I think that's especially valuable if you're typically a designer and not a builder, because that invariably feeds back into what you then draw and detail. And I think what's been brilliant about the Passive House designer course is that I've realized that for the last 30 odd years I've been detailing and designing buildings not terribly well, without a proper understanding of moisture and how buildings work, thermal bridges and things like that.
I was just going to ask, as a professional, because obviously this is a massive issue in the industry, but there would be no way of you going back to how you were once you see the light. Would that be fair?
Absolutely true. Yeah, but it is that you do see the light, and I now working on kitchen extensions and house retrofits, and I simply can't not detail it in a way that is if not full Passive House, at least adopting the principles of Passive House, because the science just makes so much sense. There's absolutely no going back.
How do we bring everyone else with us? There are more and more Passive House buildings being built, and in a second I want to ask you about your new one, the contrast there, but how can we help them see what we can see?
I think it's just chipping away at it. There is clearly a growing movement. Education is obviously key, and I believe there's now more input at university level to ensure that students at least have a basis of understanding of, if you like, the foundation of Passive House. And I think that's a really good start, and the more that can be encouraged, the better.
Okay then, so the new Passive House, how's all that?
Oh, it's very exciting. We were lucky to, well, look, funny enough, again, we went to seal bids on a bungalow in the Lake District and won that. We weren't sure what we could do with the bungalow. It's not in great shape. It's again a 1960s build, concrete panel, and I think very quickly, once we started looking at it, realised that it actually wasn't worth saving. The view is just too good, and the building is just not good enough. So we've taken the decision to replace the bungalow with a new build, and that's going to be a timber frame, going for Passive House, and if we can make it Passive House Plus, but it's we're at planning stage now, so it is a World Heritage Site, and one can never be sure what's going to emerge from their deliberations, but we're keeping our fingers crossed anyway.
Now, quite a lot of what you've said today has drawn on your professional experience. What about if you're a homeowner who knows they want to retrofit either their existing property or they're moving and know that some work needs to be done? How would you suggest they go about it?
Well, the budget is obviously key, as anybody will tell you. The projects that I'm doing at the moment, very often clients want to upgrade their house to a better standard, and it is extremely challenging to know just how far you can go within a budget. And if they are able to say they want to meet a particular standard, somehow it becomes a bit more black and white. If they don't, then you do need to look at quite a lot of options. And, from their point of view, you need to understand the difference between, what do they want to spend and what do they need to spend. They need to spend it carefully. And I think, you get what you pay for. And it's finding that balance between getting the building to a level of comfort that is what they're looking for without spending a huge amount of money. And it's not black and white, inevitably. So, I think you need to know your limitations and keep things as simple as possible.
Well, Russell, thank you very much for your time today. Fascinating stuff. Really appreciate it.
Very good. Thank you.
Head online to take a look at the show notes that accompany this session, houseplanninghelp.com/288, where you can review the main information again. We always provide a summary. Check out before and after photos of the project. If you've got a comment and you'd like to leave that at the bottom of the show notes, there's a section there for you. If you've got a question, you can also get in touch with us on social media. We'll link to Russell and to the Hesketh Hayden website, houseplanninghelp.com/288. My call to action is to check out the hub, new content in there. We've got a new video. This is towards the end of my own project. This one actually looks at some bespoke units that we had created. And it's a great opportunity when you're building something new. You've got the talented people all on site. Just give them a bit more work to do. And that's exactly what was happening here. So this sees how very simple designs for bookcases, shelves, benches, and really, I think if you put this into the grand scheme, very cost effective. So that's also the floors in the house go down. Second fix works continues, particularly on electrics. They're doing a dead test. So all of this in the latest video that we've got in the hub. We've got office hours. That's where you can have a chat with me. I make myself available every week. So whatever it might be, perhaps there's a contact that I can put you in touch with. We've also got our live training with guest experts or fellow self-builders who've completed projects, courses, the forum, all at houseplanninghelp.com/join. Next time, Roger Hunt, author of the Old House Eco Handbook, is my guest. And we're going to continue our theme of retrofit, but be looking specifically at period properties. Thanks for listening. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media. Content that matters.